handing over here. Our next speaker is James Boyd, who's the director of the Centre of Linkage at the Curtin University. His research interests include data linkage, epidemiology, benchmarking, clinical outcomes and information management. It's quite a wide range, and he's going to be talking to us about the technical challenges associated with record linkage.
Okay, thank you. That is a wide range. I don't know where you got all that stuff from.
Your website.
Must be true then. I saw Amy's talk yesterday and I realised the title of this talk is probably not the technical challenges associated, it's more about the operational challenges associated with record linkage. So what I'm going to talk about is some of the work we've done to try and develop some infrastructure to solve the problem of enduring linkage, so linkage on an ongoing basis in Australia. And I say in Australia because I actually stole a lot of these ideas from my time, as you can tell from the accent, from Scotland. So as there's nobody talking about the Scottish linkage system, Chris, I thought I'd take this opportunity to highlight the Scottish record linkage system, which has been around for a long time, and I don't think it actually gets recognised for how long it's been around, and I think the people in Scotland take it for granted for being there, and it doesn't actually get talked about in terms of it being a routine system that actually links data on a monthly, and probably more than that nowadays, basis. It provides all the health information up to date to researchers, and that information is embedded into a lot of the national statistics that are produced. So a lot of the government statisticians as well as the university statisticians use the information coming from that. The system has a strange parallel with the stuff I'm going to talk about from Western Australia, because the process started basically because people had collected information in a machine-readable form. Since 1968 it was, and based on work that was done at the Oxford record linkage system, they took some of the methods and they got help from the Oxford record linkage system, and they took some of the data from the early days in the 80s and they used a create and destroy model to link data for projects and use it, and then of course you lose the information as the next project comes along. And then around about 1991 they realised that there was a possibility to actually do this on an ongoing basis. So instead of that create and destroy, could we actually create the information and maintain a map, a linkage map over time. And that's when I got involved, and we created a system that actually produced data from 1981 onwards, which still goes. We got a chance to redevelop that with some year 2000 money, so looking at different ways of doing that. So instead of going for closed files, which is a process of tidying up all the hospital records and finalising the file and making it available, to this process of open files, so that records can change at any point in time. And that's some of the concepts that I've tried to take forward when we're doing some of the work in Australia. So that's my pitch for Scotland. I'm moving on to Australia now. So data linkage in Australia, I've said it also has considerable experience. I said there were parallels with the Scottish system. There wasn't really much communication between the two, but when I arrived in Western Australia, I found out that their system was seeded by the Oxford record linkage system, that they got help using the technology from Oxford, that they had a create and destroy model in the 80s for projects, and that around 1994 they decided that they too would go for an enduring map, so a process of creating information. Strangely, their system goes from 1981 also. How did that happen? I don't know. Probably to do with ICD codes, I would guess. But yeah, they have a system which links a number of core data sets, so health data sets, vital event information on a routine basis. I suppose the difference between Western Australia and Scotland is the fact that they have a lot of other data sets that they link into that. Now obviously that was a very useful tool for both the government university statisticians producing information, and New South Wales followed suit. They had been doing project, the create and destroy model, for a long time. In 2006 they also went for a process of enduring linkage, and other states and territories followed, and that prompted some money from the federal government to actually create a more robust kind of infrastructure of linkage across the states in Australia. So at that point in 2008, the Population Health Research Network was formed. It's a collaborative network of linkage capabilities across the whole of Australia. It has linkage units in each of the state and territories, so the ones in purple here, pink there I think. So West Australia and New South Wales, obviously the ones that were existing. There was already work going on in the various states, but the green ones represent the kind of development that the money from the Australian government helped develop. So we've got South Australia and Northern Territory who partner in the middle there. Victoria Data Linkage Unit, Tasmania Data Linkage Unit and Queensland forming the actual state linkage units. And then there was a concept of some national capability. So on the left in Western Australia, we have a PHRM programme office who manages the actual process of developing these different centres and the way the money should be spent. We have the Centre for Data Linkage, which I'm going to talk about. That's our unit in Curtin University, looking at doing some facilitation of linkage between those states and coming up with some infrastructure to solve some of the problems. The Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, who sit basically within the Australian government, so I'm going to explain why that's important in a minute. And then, very interestingly, the SACS Institute were given the task of creating a kind of secure environment, a remote environment in which the data, once linked, could be put and researchers could access it safely. So that is basically the network itself. And this is the challenge why we have different things going on, because different parts of the healthcare system are provided by different parts of government. So up the top there we have the hospital and the vital events, the birth registrations, the death registrations and the cancer registrations. That's really a state function. And in the bottom, old slide says Commonwealth there, with that federal government, do some of the primary care stuff, so immunisation, GP records, prescribing records and the kind of ageing information, the veteran affairs and ageing information. So you can see that for a lot of the projects you want to go and combine some of that information. And that's where the challenge comes in, because sharing the data is, as we've probably heard a number of talks, it's not always that easy. I want to talk a wee bit about that later on. The other part of this is like a lot of this stuff starts in health, but it's not always limited to health. So Western Australia and I would say South Australia have a big focus on looking at other government portfolios and adding data in from different places. So you can see we've got things like the criminal justice sector, so police records, court records, correction records, they're coming into the use, especially in Western Australia and South Australia, as I said, and education and things like child protection. So the linkage can go across. It usually starts in health, I seem to see, in most countries, but it can be used for most of the administrative data collections. So just moving on to some of the work we've done in the Centre for Data Linkage in Curtin University. I said that we were there to facilitate linkages for projects that were wanting to follow people across borders, so people don't stay in a state, they tend to move around. There's a possibility they'll be in other places. So the idea was that we would create infrastructure that could manage that. We probably haven't done as many of those projects as we would like due to challenges of sharing the information. But the other part of the work was to actually work to look and come up with some R&D around different data linkage methods, infrastructure that would actually help the process. So I'm just going to talk, we've heard about this, but these are the challenges to the data sharing. I mean, you've heard them all before. So the need for some sort of privacy, some control of disclosure of personal information, the need for confidentiality when you're releasing information, the need for agreements that allow you to share that information across different organisations, and then a kind of difficult one when people ask for security but are unable to tell you what type of security they want. So that means you have to try and dig into what they actually mean by that, how you're going to protect the privacy and confidentiality through policies, procedures, safeguards, a secure environment, and the latter is, well, all of that's what we went for. We went for what we thought was quite a robust information governance framework, and then we also tried to develop a secure environment to which we could store the infrastructure that we had so that the data coming in was protected. So the model we came up was influenced by all that. We had a robust governance framework which had lots of documentation of how we were going to do things and who could touch what and who could see what. We've just heard about the separation principle. It's widely used in Australia, so we had to adopt that as well. So The custodians are the ones ultimately in control of the information. They split the information into identifiers and content. I think it's payload you use here as a term. Data for researchers. The linkers use the identifiers to do the linkage and create a map, and then they pass that to the custodian, who creates the data for the researcher and passes it out. On top of that, we were required to come up with project-specific extractions so that the actual keys that we use for each of those projects are only valid for those projects, so people can't collude and share information. And if all of it else fails, all that fails, we've also looked at some of the privacy preserving linkage stuff. So we've been working with Professor Schnell in the German Record Linkage Centre to try and look at whether we can implement some of the privacy preserving linkage algorithms. So just going to touch on some of the areas we've kind of been looking at over the last 5 or 6 years. I think there was a lot of talk yesterday about the data cleaning and standardisation stuff we did. To be honest, starting afresh, Sean Randall and the team was tasked to find out what people did in terms of data cleaning and standardisation across Australia. So his first port of call was actually just to find out what people were doing. And his question to them, so how well does it work? What does it mean to the linkage quality? And that's where that paper came from. It was just him trying to collect that information and trying to assess how much you got back from the different methods that were being used. The other thing when we were setting up was we were looking for a matching engine. And Anna Ferranti and I, who were in the team at the time, actually thought that the best thing to do would be to ask each of the linkage units in Australia what they were using, pick the most common one, and that's what we would use, because then we could build on what they had, and we'd have additional skills to do the linkage and fill in some of the kind of gaps that they had. So we did ask, and everybody was using something different. I think that's a typical thing. Not only that, most of them didn't like what they had. So it was a process of, can you help us look for something else? So we designed a kind of evaluation process for us, but it ended up being shared around a number of the units, looking at some of the match engines they were using synthetic data so that we could share the information, and looking at processing speeds of different files. Now, it's useful to a point, but it got us beyond a position to make a choice of where we were going to go. The other part of this is around less about the matching engine and more about the management of the information over time. So looking at the functions, features and reporting you would require to have in a system so that you could actually manage the process over a long period of time, be able to do different data sets, link them accurately and manage the map as it's passed out to different researchers. We're also interested in looking at linkage quality, how people were actually measuring linkage quality and how we can improve it. A little bit about matching techniques. I've talked about the privacy preserving. And finally, what kind of clerical techniques were being employed in Australia, how much of an overhead that was. That's usually a resource intensive process, and if we could automate some of that. So the first process was a lot of work. We managed to get help from 2 business analysts, and although I cursed them at the time, I think they helped us get through the process of trying to identify what we wanted in a system. So we just said we wanted to do the whole linkage process, but they let us drill into the different parts of it. So from the data coming in to the kind of standardization, to the loading of the data, to the way we're going to match it and how we're going to manage it over time. The process also involved a bit of assessment of what was on or what was available within Australia at the time, and where the bottlenecks and the gaps were. So a bit of exploration about whether we could fill them. And then we came up with what we wanted to really do. So the first thing was to have some sort of matching engine. That was the very basic thing. Most importantly, a framework to manage the process right across the system from beginning to end, and then a look at quality assessment and intervention. So the ultimate idea was to come up with a system that was made up of components, because we wanted to be able to be flexible. We wanted to be able to change components at different points in time if we needed to. We wanted to be able to share different parts of the system if people wanted to get different parts of the system rather than the whole linkage service. And also we wanted to be able to manage data from different data providers in different ways, so different security settings and different ways of manage the information coming in. And because we were trying to automate things, a job monitoring process which allowed us to see where in the linkage process each project was, and a series of built-in audit trails to actually document where we're going. And you can see we kind of split the actual process into 3 different jobs. So a linkage job, so load validation linkage grouping, a quality job where you would do some sort of quality review, whether it's individual or batch, and then regrouping, and then extraction to provide the data back to the researchers. We started with a very basic probabilistic matching engine. It just did what we needed to do for the data sets we had at the time. The idea was it should be configurable so we could customize the blocking, the comparison, the scoring and the threshold, but more importantly that we could build different comparison routines or different parts of the system and easily put them in there and make it available to us and to the rest of the team. The guys did a bit of work looking at multi-threading, so we did a process of trying to maximise what we could to ensure scalability to the kind of size of Australia. I'll say it was still slower than Big Match, so don't tell them that, but it still isn't as fast as that. And the process allowed us to have a linkage engine that was either embedded into the full system or something we could use standalone. The actual outside of that, the actual main management part, the system features was that it should be a system that allowed large data volumes and managed the linkage and the output of that data, that could cope with different types of linkage projects. So one-off projects, so the kind of create and destroy model, a process of core linkage that you do on a routine basis, so an ongoing process, and the ability for people to bring their data sets in and link to the core itself. We wanted to be able to manage different types of data coming in, so not only new records being added on a routine basis, but people to be able to amend the records in there so they could actually change some of the information and also delete the information. The challenge we had that some of the custodians would only give the data for a period of time, and we had to negotiate how the data would come out without affecting the actual map itself. And then a bit about quality assessment and intervention. So the routine processing and the management over time was important, and it was something we'd done in Scotland to manage the open file handling. It allowed us to add data even if it did change in terms of some of the identifiers. And what we wanted to do with that was to be able to look at the way the data was at any point in time in the system. So you're adding lots of data over a number of years. The actual map itself will change because that data comes in and changes it. We wanted to be able to access the information of the whole map at any point in time, or to look at individual groups at any point in time. That's important because from experience from the Scottish system, the actual researchers will get an extract at a point in time, they'll do a lot of work on it, and they may get approval to get an additional variable. What they don't want is for you to give them the new file 2 years later after they've done 2 years worth of work. A lot of time they want to get the information as it was at that point in time. We did that by storing all the pair information. So the system stores all the records, all the groups and all the pair information, which allows us to do that grouping process dynamically, but also allows us to look at any of the individual records, as I said, how it looked at different points in time. So I've kind of got an example there of a group coming in and records to records that change it or quality processes that change it. So just that's the kind of main system itself. The linkage quality stuff was important to us. Again, we wanted to be able to assess the kind of quality of the linkage that was being produced by the system. As a linkage unit, you kind of want to do that if you're doing it on an ongoing basis. You want to make sure that the actual output is consistent over time, so be able to measure it and be able to assess that nothing's changed. And of course, we've had a lot of talk about the value that is to researchers as well. So researchers want to know what the quality of the information is, because it may affect the way they're doing certain analysis. It might impact on the interpretations they have. Strangely enough, everybody was again doing something differently. There was no standard metrics. I think that's a kind of consistent theme, that everybody does something slightly different. So that's something we're kind of looking at. We've got a linkage quality working group together in Australia, and we're trying to come up with at least some consistency across the different states. Within the system itself, we went for some obvious things. So we had clerical review, so the ability to look at groups, clerical intervention, the ability to change groups. We did that manually through pairs or group versions. So we actually, same as the talk yesterday, we found that producing information on the whole group actually sometimes helps the process of deciding how good a group is. Picked up some of the ideas from Scotland around suspicious groups. I think somebody used the term consistency. So suspicious groups in Scotland were things like double deaths, so 2 deaths in a group, that would suggest there's something wrong. Resurrections, if you've got a hospital record after death, there's probably something wrong. We also, I'm just going to quickly talk in the next slide about some graph theory work we did to try and identify groups that were in error without actually this manual process. And on the other side of that, the intervention stuff, so the ability to break some of these links. And we looked around a number of things. My idea was threshold manipulation, which wasn't great. And I'm going to talk about some stuff that Sean Randall did around processing rules. So the graph theory was an interesting thing. We had done a big linkage of 4 state data sets, 10 years worth of data in each. It was about 44 million records. We'd done a lot of quality on it. Going back, we actually had a go at trying to use some graph metrics. So we picked completeness, diameter and bridges. So how well connected a graph was, how far you had to traverse across it, and whether there was any kind of well-connected graphs joined by an individual line. We set some cutoffs, so for completeness, anything less than 50% was flagged up. Diameter, if you had to traverse more than 3 hops, that was flagged up. And any group with bridges, we identified. And most of them, in fact nearly all of them, had an error in them. So it was a good way of finding it. Problem was, they didn't find enough of them. So a good start, probably needs more work. The other part of this is that finding errors isn't fixing them, so just finding them doesn't really necessarily help the automation process. So my colleague did a bit of work around that suspicious group, or the consistency thing, around double deaths and records after deaths. He'd done a piece of work where he'd gathered information as he did some clerical review and tried to build those into a set of rules, using kind of a kind of knowledge acquisition, understanding the information and going through it. He applied that to some of the groups where it had gone wrong. So there's about 4,500 groups that had multiple deaths or resurrections. And using that, and it is just a prototype, we haven't written any of this up, he managed to reduce the number of errors dramatically. So 95% of the groups had a reduced number of incorrect links, and 80% had no links at all, no longer contained any incorrect links at all. So again, a promising kind of tool that might help in the future. So just to summarise what we have been doing, and I suppose like I kind of emphasise this, although it's not the technical part. So we have a well-developed governance framework which covers confidentiality, security, privacy and ethics, and that probably took longer than the technical stuff that we built to actually achieve. The actual infrastructure itself, we hope, is designed to be simple and efficient to use, so value for money, I hope, and built in a way that's interoperable, so you can actually add to it, or at least we can. We've tried to actually look at working with different units in Australia to find out what their issues are, and using that approach to try and develop some solutions that they can use and that we can use, and we hope to continue to do that over the next few years. Obviously I didn't do this all myself. I've put up the research team there within the unit, and as I said, the actual funding for the project comes from the Australian government through the National Research Infrastructure for Australia. Thank you.
Okay, a few minutes for questions.
Hello.
Thanks, really nice presentation. I've just a couple of questions.
Sure.
The automated linkage quality tool,
Yeah.
is that published?
We haven't done anything on that yet. It was just something that Sean Randall had done. He was interested based on the fact that the actual clerical process is like really resource intensive, and like a lot of time we use that to feed back into the linkage process, so to improve the linkage. But he was interested for some of the kind of strange groups that come up that are not in that kind of grey zone. So he was actually using it to try and sort out some of those automatically, and it was just him and a couple of the clerical reviewers getting together, coming up with a whole set of rules that they built into it to try and solve it. it seems to work. We'd like to do a bit more work on it before we do anything else. But yeah, it might be something that people can use. It certainly will reduce the actual burden if it can work.
And with the graph theory,
Yeah,
what kind of software did you use?
it was Python really. It was just Python. Again, we haven't gone to the graph database side yet, basically because a lot of the stuff we've done through it's the SQL Server database in the back that we actually do for the big stuff, and a .NET framework. We haven't gone to the graph database itself. I know there's a few people looking at that, and obviously we'll get some performance improvements if we do that. But we just went for, in the simple sense, just the Python stuff, loaded the actual groups in there, and did some of this through it. It was slow.
Any others?
Andy?
Hi James, thanks for that. Your experience in Australia of moving from this create and destroy model to
Yeah.
the enduring preservation, how did you convince the powers that be that this was an acceptable way forward?
Still haven't convinced them, to be honest. I mean, to be honest, my experience in Scotland was that you start with people who've never done record linkage before, so you're working with custodians who've never done this before. You talk them through the process. They'll give you the opportunity to do a project, and you work with them on that project. You try and do it safely, you do it securely. You work with them, you socialise them to the process itself. They become happy, and they'll do it maybe a couple of times. At that point, they also then get fed up extracting the same information over and over again, okay? And that's when you can actually move forward and say, can we do this on a more permanent basis? You know, and that's the way it's worked. I see no difference in Australia. I mean, that's the way Western Australia and New South Wales got started. I'm hoping with some of the work we're doing in the kind of the federal government space that we can do the same thing, that we can get a few projects under our belt, we can convince them it's pretty safe, and then we can actually move into a more enduring basis.
Anybody else? Can I just ask you in relation to that? So you talked about value for money a couple of times.
Yeah.
Has your work enabled you to sort of leverage a cost model for the sort of end-to-end process?
We're actually terrible at that. I've got to say again, there was a piece of work done by the programme office looking at the charging model, because obviously if you're doing linkage in different states, you don't want to be charging a researcher more in one state than another. But it's hard to actually put a cost on it. Some people do it on the number of links they extract, some people do it on the number of hours that people spend actually linking this. So there seems to be a variety. If anybody can nail that cost model, it would be real good. And I would say the other thing is that nobody managed to recover enough money to actually sustain the actual systems themselves.
All right.
It's always topped off, even in Scotland.
Okay.
Okay.
Right. Well, thank you very
Thank
much.
you.